Hi, this is Dr. Kat Vlies from Central New Mexico Community College. We'll continue here with the digestive system, and I'll refer to this particular video as Part B. We're going to focus here on the peritoneal cavity along with its serosa and learn which structures belong inside of the peritoneal cavity and which ones do not. Those structures in our abdominal pelvic cavity, I should say, that are covered by the visceral peritoneum, we refer to them as peritoneal organs, or even better, intraperitoneal. Remember the term intra, or the prefix intra means within, not to be confused with inter, which means in between. We also have organs that are located behind the peritoneal cavity, behind the serosa that define the peritoneal cavity. We call them retroperitoneal, and we'll see which ones they are. And then there are some organs that we find totally outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and a good example of that is the esophagus, and we refer to them as extraperitoneal. Anytime there's an inflammation of the peritoneal serosa, we talk about peritonitis. Let's take a look to get a better understanding of what the peritoneal cavity is all about, the peritoneal serosa that delineates the peritoneal cavity, and the folds that these peritoneal serosa produce. So in the upper left figure here, we see a cross-section of our abdomen. And if I follow this red line, which represents our visceral and parietal peritoneum, you notice that it nicely pushes up against the anterior body wall, even the posterior body wall, but then it starts to enclose some structures completely, like the small intestine, and other structures not completely. For instance, the structures that are only partially covered and sit actually behind the peritoneal cavity are this one, and this one, and even these two. So these last few structures that I just pointed to that sit behind the peritoneal cavity we call retroperitoneal. All the other ones are inside of our peritoneal cavity, PC for peritoneal cavity. So true intraperitoneal structures are going to be completely surrounded, like this one, with a visceral and parietal peritoneum. Now, the other thing that we see happening is that the visceral and parietal peritoneum will start to go on its way to, for instance, in this case, the small intestine, wrap around it, and then come back out to where we form a double layer of visceral and parietal peritoneum, referred to as mesentery. Now, there are different forms of mesentery, but certainly at the level of the small intestine, this mesentery is what is responsible for holding together all the coils of the small intestine and keeping it in place. And clearly, it's basically a structure that holds the small intestine also anchored towards the posterior wall. We'll talk more about these different kinds of mesentery in just a moment. Let's now take a look at the bottom figure. Once again, all of this here represents our abdominal pelvic cavity, but only the structures in the pinkish and bluish zone are part of the peritoneal cavity. So here we have our visceral and parietal peritoneum, and as we go to the posterior abdominal wall, we see it forming different areas of mesentery, some thicker than others, as we'll learn about. Here we see a much thicker level or type of mesentery called the greater omentum. And notice that there are some structures that sit behind the peritoneal cavity. The pancreas, the duodenum, which is the proximal part of the small intestine, are perfect examples of that. So what sets apart the intraperitoneal structures that would be located in our peritoneal cavity from our retroperitoneal structures, such as this part of the colon and even this kidney, is the fact that retroperitoneal structures are only partially covered by our visceral and parietal serosa. So for instance, the kidney here is only covered on this side, and this part of the large intestine is only covered on these sides. So we don't see the whole structure completely surrounded by our peritoneal serosi. So good examples of retroperitoneal organs that belong to the digestive system are the pancreas, the duodenum, which is the proximal part of the small intestine, and as it says here, the part that is the absolute closest to the stomach is actually intraperitoneal, but once it gets going and starts to form the rest of the small intestine, it's definitely retroperitoneal. And then these two parts of the large intestine we'll talk about or learn about soon, the ascending and descending colon. Now, as I said, there are areas where the peritoneal serosi kind of fuse together to help anchor our structures, and we refer to it as mesentery. We see this especially at the level of the small intestine, where the mesentery holds the coils together of the small intestine and also keeps the small intestine anchored onto the posterior abdominal wall. We also see something similar in the case of the large intestine, and we refer to it then as the mesocolon. But all of these structures are really pretty much continuous with one another. The mesocolon is referred to the two areas that essentially staple the large intestine against the posterior wall to keep it in place. There are these two really fatty types of mesentery we refer to as the omenta, singular omentum. We have the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. We'll learn about these more when we get to the stomach, because both of them are attached to the stomach. And finally, there is the so-called falciform ligament that helps anchor the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and to some extent the diaphragm, rather than the posterior body wall. So several of the mesentery, mesocolon hold our intestines attached to the posterior body wall. The omenta and the ligament of the liver especially help with anchoring things to the anterior body wall. So this wraps up our discussion of the peritoneal cavity with the serosi and the folds that the serosi produce.